I spent 31 years reading deeds for a living, and I can tell you the exact moment a property record is wrong before I finish the second paragraph. So when the Pinewood Glen Homeowners Association mailed me a notice of abandonment for 11 acres my father bought in 1961, I didn't call a lawyer. I made coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and read it twice. The notice was dated March 4th. It cited Section 14.2 of the HOA's governing covenants. Land unused, unmaintained, and unclaimed for a period exceeding 10 years reverts to common association property. Attached was a determination from the board, signed by HOA President Dana Whitfield, stating the parcel had been vacant since at least 2014, with no recorded activity, no tax payment history under a current owner, and no response to 2 prior notices mailed to a last known address that wasn't mine. They were already moving. The notice said survey crews would mark the new common area boundary within 30 days, and that any structures or personal property remaining on site after that date may be removed at owner's expense, if an owner can be identified. If an owner can be identified. I'd paid the property taxes on that land every November for the last 19 years, ever since my father passed it to me outright. I had the canceled checks. I had the deed. What I didn't have, not yet, was any idea how an association with no legal claim to the property had convinced a county office to let them act like it already belonged to them. I drove out to the parcel that afternoon. The access road was still gravel, the way my father graded it in 1974, and at the tree line where the old fence used to run, there were 2 stakes with pink survey ribbon already tied off, dated 9 days earlier. Someone had been out there before the notice ever reached my mailbox. I'm not a man who raises his voice. 31 years examining title doesn't make you a fighter. It makes you patient, and it makes you exact. So I didn't call Dana Whitfield. I didn't call a lawyer, not that week. I went to the county recorder's office instead, because if there was a hole in their claim, it wasn't going to be found in an argument. It was going to be found in a document, sitting in a drawer, exactly where the last 40 years had put it. I just had to find which one. My name is Walter Hutchins. I'm 68 years old, and for 31 years I worked as a title insurance examiner, first for a regional underwriter out of Columbus, later running my own small examination practice until I retired in 2019. The job is invisible to most people. You only notice a title examiner when something is wrong. A lien nobody disclosed, a boundary that doesn't match the survey, an heir nobody listed on a death certificate. I spent my career finding the thing that didn't match. It teaches you to slow down. It teaches you that paperwork outlives memory, and that memory is usually wrong about dates, while paper rarely is. That morning, with the HOA's letter flat on the table in front of me, I didn't feel panic. I felt the specific, low-grade irritation of looking at a document with a hole in it. Whoever drafted this notice had skipped a step. I just didn't know yet which step, or how deep it went. The land itself goes back to October of 1961, when my father, Roy Hutchins, bought 11 acres outside what was then unincorporated county land for $3,800, paid in 2 installments over 6 months because that's what the seller agreed to, and my father didn't believe in carrying debt longer than he had to. There was no HOA, there was no neighborhood. There was a county road, a creek running along the eastern boundary, and enough oak and shortleaf pine that my father called it his hunting ground for the next 4 decades. He built a 1-room cabin on it in 1963, mostly by hand, using lumber he hauled out himself in a borrowed flatbed truck 2 boards at a time. We'd go out there 2 or 3 weekends a year, spring for the fence work, fall for deer season. He never farmed it, never logged it commercially, never tried to develop so much as an acre. He just owned it, the way men of his generation owned things, quietly, without announcement, and with the paperwork filed correctly the first time, so it never had to be filed again. Pinewood Glen didn't exist until 1988, when a developer named Hargrove Properties bought the surrounding 60 acres and platted it into 40 home lots, forming a homeowners association to manage the new subdivision's common areas, drainage easements, and a shared entrance road off the county highway. My father's 11 acres sat at the edge of the new development, technically adjacent but never part of the plat, separated from the new lots by little more than a survey line and, for a while, an old barbed wire fence that predated all of it. When the annexation vote went through that June, the developer's attorney filed an exclusion for 3 parcels that predated the subdivision and whose owners hadn't consented to join. My father's land was one of them, listed in the original filing as Parcel 14B, excluded from the association's Common Assessment and Governance under Section 9.3 of the Founding Covenants. I didn't know the parcel number by memory in March of this year. I knew the broader shape of the story, that my father's land had been there before the HOA and wasn't part of it, because he'd told me as much more than once, usually while we were fixing the cabin's roof or restringing a fence line, the kind of detail a man mentions in passing because he assumes everyone already knows it. What I didn't know yet was that this exclusion had been filed, recorded, and witnessed in 1988, sitting in a county records book that nobody at Pinewood Glen had apparently opened in 38 years. My father died in November of 2007 of a heart condition that gave us about 4 months of warning, which he used mostly to put his affairs in order, with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything else. He'd filed a transfer on death deed with the county that February, naming me as sole beneficiary of the 11 acres, effective automatically on his death without probate. I remember going down to the recorder's office myself that winter, a few weeks after the funeral, to confirm the deed had been properly indexed. It had. Book 884, page 219. I wrote the page number on a sticky note and kept it folded in my wallet for 2 years out of habit, the way an examiner double-checks his own work even when there's no client waiting on the answer. For most title examiners, the distinction between abandonment and adverse possession is second nature, drilled into you in the first year of the work, because the two get confused constantly by people who've never had to learn the difference. Abandonment, as a legal doctrine, requires proof of an owner's actual intent to relinquish a property right, not silence, not absence, not unanswered mail sent to the wrong address. Adverse possession is a different and much stricter doctrine entirely, requiring continuous, open, and hostile use of land by someone other than the owner for a statutory period that in most states runs well past 10 years, and demands the possessor prove every element of that use in court before a judge, not assert it in a board resolution. An HOA invoking an internal abandonment clause against a recorded tax-paying owner isn't relying on either doctrine correctly. They're relying on the owner not knowing the difference and not checking the file. I'd seen this exact confusion play out in my professional life more times than I could count, almost always with the same shape. A property sits quiet for a stretch of years. An interested party with something to gain starts treating quiet as synonymous with unclaimed, and somewhere along the way, an internal policy gets written that sounds like law but isn't, because nobody who drafted it consulted an actual attorney, or did, and got an answer they didn't like and buried it. Homeowners associations are particularly prone to this kind of drift, since their governing documents are written once, amended occasionally by people without legal training, and enforced by volunteer boards who rotate every year or two and rarely read the full file before voting on something that sounds, on its face, reasonable. I checked. I never built anything more on the land after my father passed. I didn't need to. Twice a year, spring and fall, sometimes a third visit if a storm had come through, I drove out, walked the fence line, checked the cabin roof for damage, cleared deadfall off the access road, and made sure nothing had washed out where the creek cut close to the property edge. I paid the county property taxes every November, by mail, the same way my father had, the same account, the same 10-day window before the deadline, year after year without missing one. To anyone driving past on the county road, 11 acres of woods with a small cabin and no visible activity for months at a stretch might look quiet, might look like nobody was minding it. Looking quiet and being abandoned are not the same condition under the law, and I'd spent 3 decades explaining that exact distinction to people who'd nearly lost property they thought they still owned, usually because somebody with an interest in the land had been counting on them not to know it. It was only later, going back through old mail I'd filed and mostly forgotten in a drawer I hadn't opened in years, that I found 2 pieces of certified mail return receipts, one dated April of 2021 and the other June of 2022, both addressed to Walter Hutchins, 412 Brook Hollow Lane. I don't live on Brook Hollow Lane. I never have. I sat with that detail for a long moment at my kitchen table before I fully understood what it meant. Somebody, at some point, inside the HOA's own office, had sent legal notice to the wrong address, and nobody on either end had ever caught the mistake. Not me, because I never received it and had no reason to expect it. Not them, apparently, because 2 unanswered notices to a wrong address had quietly become, somewhere in their file, proof that an owner didn't care enough to respond. My wife Eleanor passed in 2019, the same year I retired, and the 2 events arriving together the way they did left me with more quiet time than I'd planned for. The land became something closer to a routine than a hobby in the years that followed. A place I drove to without needing a particular reason, the way some men keep going to the same diner counter even after the friends they used to meet there have stopped showing up. My daughter Karen lives 2 states over with her own family and calls most Sundays. She'd been the one, that March, who suggested over the phone that I scan the HOA's notice and send it to her so she'd have a copy somewhere other than my kitchen drawer, a habit she picked up after watching her mother's affairs get tangled in paperwork nobody could locate when it mattered. I did, mostly to humor her. I didn't expect at the time that the scan would end up being useful for anything beyond her own peace of mind. I'd examined enough title files over the decades to know that institutions rarely correct themselves on their own. A bank doesn't waive a fee because it realizes the fee was wrongly applied. A county doesn't catch a misfiled lien because someone in the office happened to notice. Corrections happen because someone outside the institution looked closely enough and cared enough about being right rather than simply being finished to point at the specific page where the error lived. I'd built an entire career on being that someone for other people's properties. It hadn't occurred to me, until that March morning, that I might eventually need to be that someone for my own. The county recorder's office is a low brick building with a flat roof and a flagpole out front that's needed a new rope since before I retired, a building I'd walked into hundreds of times during my career, though never before on my own behalf. Marjorie Combs had worked the deed records counter for as long as I could remember, a woman who moved through index books and microfiche reels with the same unhurried precision I used to bring to my own file reviews, the kind of precision that looks like slowness to someone in a hurry and looks like competence to anyone who's ever needed a record found correctly the first time. I told her what I needed: the original 1988 annexation file for Pinewood Glen, and anything cross-referenced to Parcel 14B. She didn't ask why. She pulled a ledger from beneath the counter, ran her finger down a column of book and page references, found the one she wanted, and walked back into the records vault without another word. 15 minutes later, she came back with a manila folder soft at the corners from handling, the kind of folder that hadn't been requested, by her own count when I asked her later, in well over a decade. The annexation petition was 11 pages, typed on a manual machine with the slightly uneven baseline that gives away its age before you even check the date, with the developer's attorney's signature on the final page and 3 exclusion riders stapled behind it. The second rider read, in language I'd seen 100 times across my career and never once for my own land: Parcel 14B, owner occupied at time of annexation, excluded from association common assessment, governance, and use restriction pursuant to Section 9.3 by agreement of record owner Roy E. Hutchins, dated June 14, 1988. My father had signed it. I'd never seen the document before that afternoon, but I recognized his signature instantly, the same compressed leftward slant he used on everything from bank checks to the inside cover of his hunting log, a signature I could have picked out of 100 without looking twice. What most people don't understand about an annexation exclusion is that it isn't a courtesy extended by a developer to a neighboring landowner. It's a binding instrument, executed at the time a subdivision forms, carrying the same legal weight as the deed itself, recorded in the same books, indexed under the same parcel system. An HOA board doesn't have the authority to revoke that kind of exclusion by a later vote, because the board wasn't a party to the original agreement. The only entity that could modify it is the excluded owner, in writing, with the same formality the original exclusion required, witnessed and recorded the same way. A board resolution 38 years later doesn't undo a contract. It just creates a new document that conflicts with an older one, and in title law, when 2 documents conflict, the older properly recorded instrument controls, every time, without exception. I made 3 copies of the annexation file before I left the building, one for my own records, one I'd eventually hand to the board, and one I left, unprompted, with Marjorie, just in case. She asked, almost as an afterthought while she was stamping my copies, whether I wanted the file flagged in the county's system so it would surface automatically on any future title search of the parcel. I told her yes. It was the first thing that day that felt like it mattered more than my own case, the kind of small correction that protects the next owner 30 years from now who'd otherwise inherit the same problem. From there, I filed a public records request with the county for Pinewood Glen's complete notice file on the abandonment determination. Every letter the HOA claimed to have sent, every certified mail receipt, every internal memo referencing parcel 14B by number. It took 11 days to come back, longer than I expected for what should have been a routine request, which told me something on its own about how often that particular file actually got touched by anyone on the HOA's side. The notice file confirmed what I'd already suspected from the receipts sitting in my own filing cabinet. 2 certified letters, dated April of 2021 and June of 2022, both addressed to 412 Brook Hollow Lane, both signed for on delivery by someone whose signature I didn't recognize, and whose name appeared nowhere else in any record connected to my family. I drove past that address on my way home from the records office, slowing down without quite meaning to. It was 3 streets over from mine, inside the Pinewood Glen plat itself, a single-story brick house with a different family's minivan parked in the driveway and a child's bicycle tipped over on the lawn. A quick check of the county's prior owner index back at my own kitchen table that evening showed a different Hutchins family, no relation to mine that I could find, had lived there until they sold the house and moved out of state in October of 2013. Someone inside the HOA's office, at some point in the years since, had matched my last name to a property inside their own subdivision and never verified the connection beyond the surname matching. The wrong Hutchins had been receiving my legal mail for years, or more accurately, nobody had been receiving it at all, since that family no longer lived there either by the time the second notice went out. I called the HOA office on a Tuesday morning, a little after 9, coffee still warm beside me at the kitchen table. Dana Whitfield answered herself, which I hadn't expected from a board president of a 40-lot subdivision. I introduced myself, gave her the parcel number, and asked, evenly, whether the board had reviewed the original 1988 annexation file before issuing the notice of abandonment. "Mr. Hutchins, I want to be straightforward with you," she said, her tone clipped in the particular way of someone who'd already decided how this call would go before it started. The board followed proper process on this. 2 notices were mailed, both went unanswered, and the file's been open for going on 4 years. I don't have the bandwidth to relitigate a 4-year-old file because somebody finally noticed there's a problem. I asked her, still calm, whether anyone had verified the mailing address against the current deed records before those notices went out. "The address came from our resident database," she said. "If it's wrong, that's not really something I can audit case by case. We act on the information we have. The survey work is already scheduled. I'd encourage you to get whatever documentation you think you have together, because the board's next vote on disposition is in 2 weeks, and I don't anticipate it changing." She hung up before I could ask the next question, the one I most wanted answered, which was whether anyone on that board had ever pulled the 1988 file at all, or whether the entire abandonment process had moved forward on an assumption nobody had bothered to test. I drove out to the property that weekend with a specific intention, not to confront anyone, just to look. What I found stopped me at the tree line before I'd even gotten out of the truck. The survey ribbon I'd seen 9 days before the original notice had multiplied. Pink flagging now ran in a wide arc deep into the 11 acres, well past where my father's original fence used to stand, cutting straight through the old post line he'd set in 1974 with his own hands, and a post hole digger he kept oiled in the barn for 40 years. 2 of those posts had been sawn through cleanly at the base, the cut still pale and unweathered against the gray, sun-bleached wood around them, sawdust still scattered loose in the dirt where it had fallen. Whoever did the cutting hadn't asked permission, hadn't left a notice, hadn't so much as nailed a card to the stump. They'd simply walked onto land that wasn't theirs, and started marking it as though it already was. I requested a copy of whatever planning document justified that expanded survey boundary. It took another public records request and a follow-up phone call before I finally got it. A board planning memo from January, describing a proposed common recreation area to be developed on the parcel once the abandonment process concluded, complete with a rough, hand-drawn site plan showing a pavilion, a gravel parking area, and a walking trail looping roughly through the spot where my father's cabin had stood for over 60 years. I started building a file of my own. Not a legal complaint yet, not a demand letter, nothing with a lawyer's letterhead on it. Just documents, in order, the way I'd built case files for 31 years before I ever needed one for myself. The 1988 annexation exclusion with my father's signature on it, the transfer on death deed from book 884, page 219, 19 consecutive years of tax payment receipts under my own name and the correct parcel number, and the misdirected notice file showing both certified letters sent to an address with no documented connection to my ownership of anything. Chain of title is the foundation of everything in my old profession. The unbroken, properly recorded sequence of ownership from one party to the next, each link verifiable against the public record without anyone's permission or cooperation required. A single correctly filed and indexed document in that chain outweighs any internal determination a board can vote on in a community room on a Thursday night, because a board resolution isn't an instrument of title. It can declare whatever it wants about a property. It cannot, on its own authority, rewrite who owns it. I went back to the cabin the following Tuesday, partly to assess what the saw cuts had done to the fence line, and partly because I wanted to be standing on the land itself while I thought through what to do next. I found a third stake near the old fence corner, freshly driven, with a tag zip-tied to it reading, "Proposed Trailhead," in marker. Whoever had planned the recreation area hadn't waited for the board's vote to start staging the project. They'd treated the outcome as settled before the comment period the bylaws required had even been scheduled. I photographed the stake, the tag, and the cut posts from 3 angles each, time-stamped on my phone, and added the images to the growing file. I also drove to the county assessor's office that same week, a separate building from the recorder's, to pull the current tax roll listing for parcel 14B. The listing confirmed what I already knew from 19 years of canceled checks. The parcel was assessed and taxed under my name, current on every payment, with no delinquency flag and no lien of any kind attached. I asked the clerk there, an older man who'd been at that counter even longer than Marjorie had been at hers, whether the assessor's office had received any inquiry from Pinewood Glen's HOA in the past 2 years regarding the parcel's ownership status. He checked the inquiry log going back to 2020 and found nothing. Nobody from the HOA had ever asked the one office in the county whose entire job was confirming who paid taxes on what. That detail mattered more to me than almost anything else I'd uncovered. An HOA preparing to declare a parcel abandoned, intending to absorb it as common property and build a pavilion and parking lot on it, had apparently never once checked with the assessor's office to confirm whether someone was still paying taxes on the land they planned to take. It would have taken one phone call. It would have ended the entire matter in an afternoon, months before any notice was ever drafted. 8 days before the scheduled vote, a second letter arrived from the HOA office, this one on board letterhead rather than carrying Dana's personal signature alone. The board had voted, 7-0, to proceed with the common area conversion in 14 days, citing continued owner non-response as the basis for final action. I read that twice as well, the same way I'd read the first notice back in March. I had called the office twice by then. I'd sent one certified letter of my own, with return receipt requested, 2 full weeks earlier, addressed correctly, to the HOA's own registered office. Neither call nor that letter was acknowledged anywhere in the board's new notice. As far as their paperwork was concerned, I still hadn't said a single word. I spent the weekend before the meeting laying every document out across my dining room table in the order I intended to present them, the same staging process I'd used hundreds of times preparing a title file for a closing. The 1988 annexation petition went first, then the exclusion rider with my father's signature, then the transfer on death deed, then the tax receipts fanned in chronological order, then the misdirected notice file, then the photographs of the cut fence posts and the trailhead stake, time-stamped and printed. By Sunday evening, the table held 38 years of paper, and for the first time since the original notice arrived in March, I felt something close to certainty rather than just irritation. Not certainty that the matter would go my way, since that's never a guarantee in this kind of work. Certainty that the record, properly assembled and properly read aloud, would speak for itself in a way no board could talk over. Pinewood Glen's bylaws required an owner comment period before final disposition of any contested property matter, under Section 11.4 of the governing covenants. The same document the board had been citing against me for weeks without ever quoting that particular section back to me. I requested to be added to the agenda of the next board meeting, scheduled for the second Thursday of the month, citing that exact section in my written request, by certified mail this time, addressed correctly, with my own signature on the return receipt. The HOA's office confirmed my slot by email 2 days later. 11 minutes allotted, item 6 of 7 on a printed agenda that listed me only as owner comment, parcel 14B, no name attached, as though the board still hadn't decided whether to treat me as a person or a problem. The meeting was held in the community room attached to the subdivision's clubhouse, a space built for 40 folding chairs and a folding table at the front, fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead with the particular flicker of a ballast that's a year past needing replaced, the air carrying the specific smell of old carpet, dry erase marker, and coffee from an urn that had clearly been running since 6 that evening. I arrived 10 minutes early with a folder under my arm, thick enough that the woman checking names at the door glanced at it twice before finding my name on her list. Dana Whitfield sat at the head table reviewing notes on an index card, her irritation visible in the set of her jaw the moment she registered I'd actually shown up, rather than mailing in some half-hearted written statement she could file and ignore. Beside her sat a man I hadn't met yet, introduced in the printed agenda as Lyle Petrosky, the board secretary, paging through a stack of papers with the careful, slightly uneasy attention of someone double-checking something he should have checked weeks earlier and was only now getting around to. When my item came up, Dana spoke first, before I'd even reached the podium at the front of the room. Mr. Hutchins has requested time to address the board regarding parcel 14B, she said, reading from her card without quite looking up. I want to remind everyone that the board has already voted on this matter, and that tonight's comment period is procedural, not a reconsideration. I understand Mr. Hutchins believes he has documentation that changes the board's position. I'd just caution that showing up at the 11th hour with paperwork doesn't undo 4 years of non-response, and it's worth asking why this land suddenly matters now that the board's identified a use for it. A few board members shifted in their folding chairs, the metal legs scraping faintly against the linoleum. I set my folder on the podium, squared the edges of it without thinking, and didn't respond to the implication directly. I'd learned long ago that the fastest way to lose a room is to argue with someone's tone. The fastest way to settle a question like this one is to let a document do the talking instead, because a document doesn't raise its voice and doesn't need to. I started with the annexation file. I read the date of the 1988 petition aloud, the parcel number, and the exclusion rider language verbatim from the photocopy in my hand, then held up a copy of my father's signature on that rider, beside a notarized copy of his 2007 transfer on death deed, the two signatures visibly matching even from across the room, the same compressed slant on both. I explained, in the same even voice I'd used examining title for 3 decades, that parcel 14B had been excluded from the association's governance at the moment of formation, by written agreement, witnessed and recorded the same year the HOA itself came into legal existence, 38 years before anyone in that room had been elected to a board seat. I'd practiced none of this beforehand, not in any formal sense, but 31 years of presenting title findings to underwriters and closing attorneys leaves a rhythm in a man that doesn't need rehearsing. You state the document, you state what it proves. You move to the next one before anyone has the chance to argue with the last. I'd watched plenty of people lose a room by getting defensive too early, answering accusations that hadn't technically been made yet, filling silence with justification instead of letting the silence do its own work. I didn't fill it. I let each document sit on the podium for a beat before reaching for the next, the way you'd let a verdict settle before reading the next charge. Then I laid out the chain that followed it, one document at a time, setting each on the podium as I finished with it. The deed transferring the parcel to me in 2007, recorded at Book 884, page 219. 19 years of tax payment receipts, each one bearing my name and the correct parcel number, in chronological order. And finally, the 2 certified mail receipts the HOA's own file showed had been sent to 412 Brook Hollow Lane, a house with no recorded connection to my ownership of anything, occupied at the time by a family unrelated to mine, who had moved out of state years before the second letter was ever mailed. Every claim the original notice had made, vacant, unmaintained, unclaimed, unresponsive, came apart in the order I presented it. Not because I argued any of them down, but because each one rested on an assumption nobody had ever bothered to verify against a document that had been sitting in the county's own vault the entire time, available to anyone who thought to ask Marjorie Combs to pull it. Dana's expression didn't change much through most of it, the kind of stillness that comes from someone holding a position out of habit rather than conviction. But Lyle Petrosky had stopped writing somewhere around the third document. He was looking at the annexation file in front of him, then back at a stapled set of the board's own meeting minutes from January, flipping pages with increasing speed, the rustle of paper the only sound in the room for several long seconds. "For the record," he said finally, quietly enough that the room had to lean in to catch it, "the exclusion under Section 9.3 would have required the owner's written consent to modify or revoke. I don't see that consent anywhere in our file. I don't think we ever requested it." He looked up, first at the annexation file, then at Dana beside him. "I don't think anyone pulled the 1988 annexation record before the original notice went out. I think we sent 2 letters to an address we never confirmed, and when nobody answered, we treated that silence as the only fact we needed." Dana held the line for another moment, her voice steady but thinner than it had been 10 minutes earlier. "The board acted in good faith on the information available to it at the time," she said. "We followed our internal notice procedure exactly as written." "Your procedure didn't include checking whether the procedure was even legal to apply," Lyle said, not unkindly but without backing off the point either. "Good faith doesn't cover skipping the one document that would have stopped this before it started." Somewhere behind me, in the row of folding chairs reserved for general attendance, a woman I didn't recognize spoke up without waiting to be called on, her voice carrying easily across the small room. "I've lived here 11 years and I didn't know the board could declare somebody's land abandoned without a court involved at all. Is that actually in our covenants, or did we just assume it was?" Nobody answered her directly, which was its own kind of answer. The board chair tapped his gavel once, not to silence her so much as to mark that the floor belonged to the agenda item again, but the question hung in the room a beat longer than the tap fully erased. A board member 2 seats down, a heavy-set man I later learned served as the HOA's treasurer, asked the question that ended the discussion before anyone else could soften it further. Why hadn't due diligence on the 1988 annexation file been completed before the board authorized survey work on a parcel that was, by their own notice, still inside its disposition window? Dana didn't have a procedural answer ready, and the room noticed the gap where one should have been. I added one more document to the table at that point. The photographs of the cut fence posts and the trailhead stake marked "Proposed Trailhead," time-stamped 9 days before the board's own vote authorizing the conversion had even been scheduled. I asked, as plainly as I could manage, whether the board had authorized staking and cutting on a parcel still subject to an active comment period, or whether that work had simply begun on its own. Nobody at the table answered directly. The treasurer asked Dana whether she'd personally authorized the survey crew's expanded scope. She said the crew had been instructed to mark the boundary of the proposed common area based on the planning memo, and when asked who approved that memo for field use ahead of a final vote, she said it had come out of a planning subcommittee meeting that, as far as the minutes showed, had no quorum recorded and no formal motion attached to it. The meeting minutes from January, already entered into the public record in Lyle's own handwriting, showed the original abandonment notice had been approved on a single reading, with no motion ever made to review prior annexation or exclusion records before the vote was taken. The board chair, a quiet man who'd said almost nothing until that point, called for a motion to rescind the notice of abandonment and formally enter the 1988 exclusion into Pinewood Glen's permanent governing file, closing the matter against any future board action on the same parcel by any future board, without the same written consent the original exclusion had always required. He added a second clause to the motion, almost as an afterthought, directing the HOA's property committee to halt all survey and planning activity related to the proposed recreation area, effective immediately, pending full board review of how the planning memo had been authorized in the first place. The motion passed by a vote of 6-1. Dana was the lone dissent, her hand the only one raised against it, held up for a beat longer than it needed to be before she lowered it. I watched the chair click his pen closed on the motion, a small, unceremonious sound in a room that had gone otherwise quiet, fluorescent lights still humming overhead, the coffee urn still ticking faintly as it cooled. Lyle was already making a note on a fresh page, the property committee's halted scope written out in full, no shorthand, the kind of note a man writes when he intends for it to hold up if anyone ever questions it later. Dana sat with her hands folded in front of her, looking at a point somewhere on the table rather than at me or at the rest of the board, and nobody moved to fill the silence she'd left behind. I didn't wait around for anyone to shake my hand, and nobody offered. I gathered my documents back into the folder in the same order I'd laid them out, thanked the board for their time in 3 words, and walked out to my truck in the cold, the gravel parking lot crunching under my boots, my breath fogging once under the security light by the door before I reached the truck and let myself exhale the rest of the way. Behind me, through the clubhouse window, I could see the meeting moving on to item 7, the room's attention already shifting to whatever came next on the agenda, the way rooms do once the matter that mattered most to one person stops mattering to everyone else. I drove out to the property that same evening, before the cold could talk me out of it, headlights cutting twin tunnels through the dark along the gravel access road my father graded back in 1974. The survey ribbon was still there, pink and faintly glowing where it crossed the tree line, strung from post to cut post like a wound that hadn't been dressed yet. I parked, pulled on my gloves, and walked the boundary one stake at a time, untying each strip of flagging tape by hand and coiling it into a loose ball I'd throw away later rather than leave it tangled in the brush for the next 20 years. It took me the better part of an hour in the dark, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight, the only sound the creak somewhere off to my right, and my own boots in the leaf litter. Nobody had asked me to do it. I did it anyway. The same methodical way I'd done everything else for the last 6 weeks, because leaving it up felt like leaving a question mark hanging over land that no longer had one. Dana Whitfield didn't run for re-election to the board that fall. I heard about it secondhand, from a neighbor who still attended the meetings out of habit, who said the seat had simply gone unfilled by her name on the ballot when filing closed in September. Lyle Petrosky became the board's primary point of contact for property and records matters in her place, a quiet promotion nobody made a ceremony of. In October, I received an envelope from the HOA office. No certified mail this time, just a regular first-class stamp and my correct address typed cleanly above it. Inside was a short letter from Lyle, 2 paragraphs, acknowledging the office's failure to verify the 1988 annexation file before the original notice was issued, along with a corrected copy of the subdivision's parcel map, Parcel 14B, now marked clearly along its boundary as excluded from association governance, the way it should have read for the last 38 years if anyone had thought to check. I went back to the county recorder's office one more time that winter, on a gray Tuesday with the first hard frost of the season still silvering the grass outside. I asked Marjorie to have the 1988 exclusion formally cross-indexed directly against my parcel number in the current system, not just flagged the way she'd done before, but built permanently into the record in a way that any future title search by anyone for any reason would surface automatically and immediately, without requiring a single phone call or a folder pulled from a back vault. She walked me through the form herself, line by line, the same patience she'd shown the first day I came in. I requested a certified copy of the completed cross-index for my own records, and when I got home that afternoon, I added it to the same fireproof box my father had kept his original deed in, a gray metal box he'd bought from a hardware store sometime in the early 1970s, dented now at one corner from being moved through 3 different houses and 2 generations of hands. I thought more than once that winter about how easily the entire matter could have gone the other way. If I'd spent my career in some other line of work, never learned the difference between abandonment and adverse possession, never developed the habit of distrusting a claim until I'd seen the document behind it, I might have read that March notice the way the HOA clearly expected someone to read it, as official, final, and not worth the trouble of contesting. Most people don't have a fireproof box with 40 years of deeds inside it, and most people don't know to ask a county clerk to cross-index an exclusion rider against a parcel number. They know what a letter on official letterhead looks like, and they assume, reasonably, that an institution citing its own governing documents has actually read them. The gap between what an HOA claims and what its own paperwork supports is exactly the gap most owners never think to check. because checking requires knowing there might be something to find. In the spring, I had a surveyor, a different one this time, hired and paid by me alone, remark the original boundary my father set in 1974. At the corner nearest the county road, where the old fence line meets the ditch, I had a small brass property monument installed and stamped with the parcel's recorded number, set in a concrete collar a few inches below the grass line. It's a simple thing, low to the ground, easy to miss unless you already know to look for it. I go out there most weekends now, the way I always have, spring and fall and sometimes a third trip if a storm has come through, and I usually stop at that corner before I do anything else. I crouch down, brush off whatever leaves or dust have settled on it since my last visit, and rest my palm flat against the cold brass for a moment before I keep walking the line. The same line my father walked, the same line his signature protected in 1988 without my ever knowing it was there. The cabin still stands where he built it, the roof patched twice since I took it over, the same one-room frame holding up under another season of weather. I keep a folding chair inside the door now, and some afternoons I sit there with the door open, looking out at the trees he planted nothing of and owned all of, listening to the creek run the same way it ran in 1961, when $3,800 and a signed deed were enough to settle a question for good. I think sometimes about how the entire matter turned on a single signature, made by a man who'd been dead 17 years before anyone questioned it, on a document that sat untouched in a county vault for 38 years before it mattered to a single living soul. My father never knew the HOA he negotiated his way out of in 1988 would eventually try to take the land back by simply assuming nobody was paying attention anymore. He couldn't have known. He just did what careful men of his generation tended to do when a new authority showed up wanting something from them. He got it in writing, had it witnessed, and made sure it was filed somewhere a county clerk could find it decades later, whether or not he was around to explain it himself. That's the part of this I keep coming back to. More than the board meeting, more than Dana's letters, more than the cut fence posts. Land doesn't defend itself. Paper does, but only if somebody took the time to make the paper correct in the first place, and only if somebody else, years or decades later, takes the time to go find it. My father did his part in June of 1988, in a room I wasn't in, signing a document I didn't see until 38 years afterward. I did my part this spring, in a different room, in front of a different board, holding the same document up to the light. Neither one of us raised our voice to do it. We just made sure the record said what was true, and trusted that eventually, someone would have to read it. I never did send Dana Whitfield anything personally. No letter, no message through the HOA office, nothing marking the matter closed on my end, the way I might have once been tempted to. There didn't seem to be a point. The board's vote had already done the only thing that needed doing, and the county's record now said, permanently, what it had said since June of 1988. Whatever she believed about the land, about me, about the 4 years the file sat open under her predecessor and then under her, the brass marker at the corner of the property doesn't care what anyone believes. It just states a fact, stamped into metal, low enough to the ground that you have to know to look for it, and durable enough that it'll outlast every board Pinewood Glen ever elects. I told Karen the whole story over the phone a few weeks after the vote, walking her through it the way I'd walk a client through a closed file, document by document, the same order I'd used at the podium. She was quiet for a moment when I finished, then asked whether I was going to do anything about the 4 years the family on Brook Hollow Lane had unknowingly been on the hook for somebody else's certified mail. I told her there wasn't anything to do. They'd moved out years before any of it started, never signed for anything, never even knew their old address had been dragged into a property dispute 3 streets away. The error belonged entirely to whoever pulled my surname off a database without checking the rest of it, and the correction belonged entirely to the documents that proved them wrong. Some mistakes don't need an apology delivered to every person they brushed against. They just need to stop happening, which, as far as the county's record is concerned now, this one has. I went out to the property again the weekend after the meeting, with Karen on the phone with me the whole drive, walking her through what the cabin looked like in the early spring light, the creek running high from snowmelt, the brass marker not yet installed but already ordered from a supplier I'd found through an old colleague in the title business. She asked, near the end of the call, whether it felt different now, owning land that had technically been mine the entire time, but had spent 6 weeks looking, on paper, like it might not be. I told her it didn't feel different so much as it felt confirmed, the way a file feels once you've closed it correctly instead of just closing it. The land hadn't changed. The record around it had simply caught up to match what was already true, the way records eventually do, if somebody's willing to make them. The deed never stopped being true. It just took 38 years, 2 misdirected letters, and 1 evening at a folding table in a community room for everyone else to catch up to what the paper had said all along.